really delighted to introduce this evening's speaker, Mike Toms. Mike is Head of Communications at the British Trust for Ornithology, which we all know as the BTO, and he's overseen the BTO's Garden Ecology team for more than a decade. He's the author of a number of books, including the volume Garden Birds in the very well-respected New Naturalist series that's published by Collins. So we're really delighted to have him here to talk to us this evening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to hand you over to Mike Toms. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I just want to check with someone that they can see the screen and that's visible, and you've got a nice little robin sitting on a garden fork. So
yes. That's all
see that.
Good. Right. So what I want to do this evening is tackle this question of whether gardens are good for birds. And I want to start by kind of setting the scene, talking a little bit about the urban environment, the garden environment, and the bird communities that use that, and then really go on to explore some of the work that we have done and others have done around different aspects of birds in gardens. So things like feeding, things like disease, predation, the way in which we manage our gardens, and then kind of at the end, kind of wrap that up together and come back to this question that we posed right at the beginning of whether gardens are good for birds. So for those who don't know the BTO, we are a research-based organisation that works in partnership with about 60,000 volunteers across the UK to collect information on what is happening with bird populations in many different habitats. And we were formed back in the 1930s, originally based down at the Edward Gray Institute in Oxford. Then we moved to Tring, and we're now based on the Norfolk-Suffolk border in a place called Thetford. And we have this amazing building, 12th century ruin, an old nunnery that hosts about 70 staff who are kind of focused on analysis and research and running surveys, our support staff. And we also have offices up in Scotland, in Wales, and in Northern Ireland. And the key thing about BTO and the information that we collect is that those data tell us about the changing nature of bird populations, about their changing distribution, their changing status, and the reasons behind those changes. So just an image here of a grey heron, because this is the species that we've been monitoring for the longest period of time. Our heronry census started in the 1930s, and it tells us about population change in herons. And we can see from the data that we collect that cold winter weather, severe winter weather, can have an impact on those populations. But you'll also know us from the work that we do around atlases, about annual surveys like the Breeding Bird Survey, bird ringing, from the tracking work that we're doing, things like cuckoos, nightjars, nightingales. So there's a wealth of information that we collect, and that information underpins conservation work, it underpins policy, underpins decisions about the way in which we manage our environment. And of course, urban habitats are part of that. And it's really important that we can collect information to understand what is happening in the built environment. Now, back in 2008, we hit a turning point. We hit this stage where 50% of the population was now living in urban habitats. So urbanized cities, towns, larger rural settlements. And that was the first time in history that we've seen that switch from a population that was dominantly in rural habitats to one that is in urbanized landscapes. And it's estimated that by 2050, we will actually pass 2/3 of us living in urbanized landscapes. And that has consequences for biodiversity, not just in terms of the footprint of those towns and cities, but also in the resources that are needed to support them. The food that is grown out in the wider countryside, the timber and the other products which are used to keep society going. Now, one of the challenges for us is where that urbanisation is taking place. This is part of a global map that shows biodiversity hotspots. And you can see here these darker colour areas, say the Horn of Africa, South Africa, around the Mediterranean and across into Southeast Asia. These are places which are richest in biodiversity. And many of these areas are also where we're seeing the most rapid rates of urbanisation, and that's particularly true in Southeast Asia. So the process of urbanisation is going to have impacts on biodiversity, and we need to understand what those will be. When we look a little bit closer to home and we think about the built environment, clearly there are birds that have learned to adapt to the opportunities that are on offer within the built environment. And what we know about these species is they tend to be opportunistic. They are species that quite often will have quite a broad diet. They're not specialist species. And particular groups, I mean, things like the pigeons and doves, the corvids, are very well represented within those species that we would call urban adapters, species that are able to adapt to the urban environment. But other species are missing. If you look at your own garden feeding station, you'll see a lot of birds that feed on seed, but you don't see lots of insectivores. So warblers tend to be species that lose out in the built environment. So we need to understand the way in which these different groups of species use gardens, use the wider environment. Now, the other important thing to say at the outset is many of our towns and cities are actually quite green. So this is London, and you can see many of the parks, the larger areas of woodland, but that pale green that you can see as a wash right across this map, those are private domestic gardens. And private domestic gardens are the biggest contributors of green space in the built environment. And if you pulled all of the gardens together across the UK, they would actually occupy an area greater than is laid down to nature reserves. It is an area bigger than the county of Suffolk. And that's really important because I'm sure many of us, when we think about our gardens, we get dismissive. We think, well, it's just a garden. It's not really having any impact. What I do in my garden doesn't matter. And what I want to do tonight is kind of make you think a little bit more about that, because your garden is one of many, many gardens, and collectively these things do add up. So that question of whether gardens are good for birds, what I'd like to do is just open a quick poll right at the start here and say, could you just decide, tick yes, no, or not sure? Do you think gardens are good for birds? We'll come back to the result of that at the end. So we're already up to 50% of you have voted, which is fantastic. Whizzing past 2/3, 3/4. That's pretty impressive. And an interesting response from you as an audience. You're all obviously very well educated in garden birds. 2 people who don't think gardens are good for birds. 9 who are not sure, which is good. That's where you should be at this stage in the talk. Have your mind open, see what I've got to say, and then come back and form a decision. And 91% of you saying that gardens are good for birds. So we will come back to that a little bit later as we will run through the talk. So thinking about gardens then, one of the key things about gardens is that they're really diverse. You know, there are some common features, but gardens really reflect the people that own them. We're all influenced by our neighbours to some extent, by peer pressure, by what we see on the television, on Gardener's World or elsewhere. And we do see trends. One of the trends we're seeing now, certainly over the last few years, and certainly since lockdown, is about the focus on nature in gardens and people trying to attract wildlife and to benefit wildlife in gardens. And this is a garden from Chelsea Flower Show a few years ago, which was really aimed at being very contemporary, but focused on birds. And you can see right up in the front of the picture, we have a bird feeder. We have a semi-naturalistic planting that is good for invertebrates. We've got some taller shrubs, some trees, which are really good for drawing birds in and for providing nesting opportunities. So we look at gardens from our perspective. We have an aesthetic interest in them, maybe a functional interest in how we use them. But for birds, they are a resource. And it might be the redwing that comes into a garden to feed on berries. It might be the bullfinches that come into a feed, or house sparrows or whatever that come into a garden to take food. And food is really the big draw for most of these species. The work that we've done looking at this shows this very clearly. Food attracts birds in. It's a really significant resource. Across the UK, we spend something like £200 million per year on bird food and bird feeding products. And it's been estimated that for every feeder that is up in, more than enough food present within that to support all of the seed-eating birds in the UK across the country. There is so much food available for them. But interestingly, birds haven't moved into gardens en masse. It is a resource that they use on their terms. I wanted to just also mention nesting opportunities, because that's the other reason that birds might use gardens. This is a collar dove that every year has a go on the security light at the BTO offices. Pretty much every year it fails. I mean, very good nests. They're always pretty flimsy. You can quite often see the eggs through the bottom of the nest from below. And invariably this one fails because of that, the eggs fall through. But they're very persistent birds. They've been very successful. But it is a nesting opportunity. All it needs is that bracket. For a blackbird, it might be some ivy cover on a wall or on a tall shrub, things like robin, somewhere a little bit more secure. And so these birds are coming in and using our resources. So what can we understand? What can we learn about the way in which birds use these resources? And can we then use that knowledge to inform decisions about how we manage gardens and urban green space? Now, I'm going to show you one or two graphs tonight, and these all come from, or pretty much all come from, the BTO's weekly Garden BirdWatch. And this is a free survey that anybody can participate in, and people record what they see in their gardens on a weekly basis. And this graph shows an average year running along the bottom from January to December. And up the side, we have this measure which we call a reporting rate. And it's really just the proportion of gardens, the proportion of sites that reported that species in that week. So if half of you here tonight had robin in your garden this week, the reporting rate for this week would be 50%. It's as simple as that. And what I've done here is produce the average pattern for robin, but split it by garden type. And there are two things that you can see from this plot. The first thing is that the reporting rate for rural gardens is the highest. It's the one up the top here, the green line. And urban gardens is the bottom. It's the brown line down here. And in between the two is the suburban gardens. So that tells us that robins use gardens in the order of rural or preferred, then suburban, and then urban. You can also see that there is a seasonal pattern to garden use. There is this breeding season trough and this kind of winter, spring, autumn, winter peak in garden use. And that suggests quite strongly that while robins can use gardens as a wintering site, they are less well used, the gardens, in the breeding season, and perhaps there aren't the breeding opportunities for the birds. So looking at these seasonal patterns across the year is really informative. And that's something you'll see a little bit later when we look at a few other species. So why might gardens not be great for breeding? Even though most of these birds that are coming in using gardens are taking seed from our bird tables, pretty much all of them feed their chicks on invertebrates. And you know, this year is a really good example of why it is challenging in gardens. You know, we've had some terrible weather this year. The season is all over the place. This is a brood of blue tits in one of my garden nest boxes this season, and they really struggled. And lots of other people were in touch with this year saying, my blue tits, my great tits have really struggled. Lots of reports of chicks dying in the nest. And that really is down to food supply and to poor weather. Because these birds feed on invertebrates, in the case of blue tits, they really focus on caterpillars. If they're living in a garden environment, we just don't have the abundance of caterpillars that you find in a piece of broadleaf oak woodland, which is their preferred habitat, their most productive habitat. So already, by choosing to breed in a garden, they're at a disadvantage. And in a year when things are tough, when the weather's not great and the caterpillar abundance is low, they can suffer really high failure rates with lots of nestling losses right through the nestling period. And that's what we've been seeing this year. There is a question then, is how important are gardens for UK breeding birds? You know, what proportion of birds breed in UK gardens? And we have data from another BTO survey, one that we run in conjunction with JNCC and RSPB, called the Breeding Bird Survey. And this is about people going out into a whole range of habitats, walking a transect twice through the breeding season, recording what they see, and we can produce estimates of the densities of birds in those habitats, and by scaling that up, the total number of birds in those habitats across the UK. And what's really interesting is when you look at these species in particular, you can see this orange slice, the dark orange slice, that's the proportion of the breeding population of these species that lives alongside us in human habitats. And as you might expect, species like house sparrow, it's nearly 2/3, starling, it's just over half. But interestingly, species that you might think of as wider countryside birds like blackbird and song thrush, it's 1/4 to 1/3. So gardens are important for a significant proportion of these populations. So if we do something in gardens that's, you know, has a negative impact on blackbirds, we could be affecting 1/3 of the UK blackbird population. So gardens are important in the sense of what they hold across the breeding season. Of course, not all species are what you might think of as garden birds. There are species, for example, like yellowhammer, which we think of as a farmland bird. And you might think, well, you know, is this relevant to gardens? Are gardens doing anything that benefits yellowhammer? When we look at information from the most recent bird atlas, carried out 2007 to 2011, we can produce a map of abundance. And yellowhammer is really good because what it effectively shows you is that this species avoids uplands and it avoids urban habitats, because you can see London is a white patch. You can pick out Norwich up in East Anglia where I am, and lots of other cities really stand out on this map. So it is not a bird that has adapted to the urban landscape by far. But what is interesting, when you look at the Garden BirdWatch data, the weekly data collected over time, you do get a peak in garden use, and it's a seasonal peak. So in this instance, rather than produce an average, I've plotted a number of years. The most recent years in this plot are the darker colours, this black line at the top. And you can see that even though the reporting rate is really low, it's below 1% of gardens, there is this seasonal variation and there is this late winter peak in garden use. And if you were to split these data out and just show rural gardens, then the peak would be even more pronounced. Rural gardens provide opportunities for farmland birds, particularly farmland seed eaters like yellowhammer, tree sparrow, reed bunting, to come in and feed during the time of the year when natural seed supplies within the farmed landscape are at their lowest. So many decades ago, these birds would have been able to feed on spilt grain. They would have been able to feed in stubble fields. And of course, farming is now much more efficient. We don't have overwinter stubbles. We don't really have the feeding opportunities that used to be there. And so gardens have become more important. And you can see that in the particular case of the searle bunting down in Devon, where the work to reinforce that population has really benefited from people feeding these birds through the winter months and getting them through that very difficult period. So there is a sense then that birds will utilise gardens and the food resources, the nesting resources that are available. So what can we learn about that? If we take a common species like blackbird, the chances are that you will all have blackbirds visiting your garden. And many people will just assume, okay, I have blackbirds, they're here all year around. if I was to put up a plot of blackbird using gardens, the reporting rate from Garden BirdWatch, it'd just be a straight line across the year, and it'd probably be close to 100%. But when you look across the many thousands of gardens that contribute to our weekly survey, what you see is a seasonal pattern. You have in every year what we call a late summer, early autumn trough. So yes, for most of the year, the reporting rate is close to 100%. It's always in the top 3 garden bird species. But we have this autumn trough when that rate drops away. And there has to be an ecological or a behavioural reason for that. And in the case of blackbird, it's probably 2 things that are important here. One is the breeding season has finished and the adult birds are undergoing their main molt of the year, and they become more secretive and more difficult to see. But also you'll get birds moving out into other habitats, other areas, so outside gardens, maybe into parks, maybe into the wider countryside, to feed on the abundance of food that's available there. So there's a seasonality to this use of gardens, even in a species like blackbird, which you just think is really, really common. And you see the same thing in species like blue tit, where again, you might assume there isn't much movement going on. But interestingly, in the case of blue tit, ringing work has shown if you are ringing in a garden where you've got feeders, throughout the day, you will find you actually have a succession of different blue tits coming through. So even though you might look at your feeders and only ever see 3 blue tits feeding, over the course of the day, that might be 30, 40, 50, or even more individuals passing through. So your garden is being used as part of a wider mosaic. And we can start to see that for other species. So this is coal tit. Coal tit tends to lose out around feeders to blue tits and great tits. It's less dominant. It'll quite often come in, take a seed and take that seed elsewhere to eat or to cache in case it can find it later. And it's a species that quite often will feed in coniferous woodland, and it's a species that's benefited because of the expansion in coniferous woodland across the UK. When we look at the Garden BirdWatch data, this is a little run from a study we did a few years ago, you can see again we've got this strong seasonal pattern of peaks and troughs. But interestingly, the size of the peaks differs. There are some years where the peaks are suppressed. They're not as high as the others. And the analysis that we did to look at that involved looking at garden use alongside the size of the Sitka spruce seed crop. And Sitka spruce, like many other trees, produces a mass of seed every few years, and it's called masting. And the reason the trees do this is to basically put so much seed out there that the predators, the seed predators, the mice and the birds can't eat it all. They can't have an impact on it. So more of that seed gets through and has the opportunity to germinate and to produce new plants. If the trees put out loads of seed every year, then of course the predator numbers would just go up and up and up. So this is a way of keeping those in check. And what we found was that garden use dropped in those years when there was a masting event. And that means that these birds were out there feeding in the wider countryside, and they were only coming into gardens in increased numbers in those years when the seed wasn't available in the wider countryside. So they're selecting where they're feeding. And of course, birds are mobile, and they're able to do this in a way that other species might not be able to. We can also look at the longer term consequences of behavioural responses, ecological responses. And goldfinch is a really good species to use as an example. And just while we're on this cracking shot by Jill Pakenham, I just wanted to give you a little tip on goldfinch identification in terms of sexing individuals. If you look just above the eye on this individual, you can see the little patch of red pushes back into the white. And that tells me that this is a male, because in the females, the white pushes into the red. And so if you get a good view of goldfinches on your feeders, you can impress your friends by saying, oh, that's a male, that's a female. It's a really neat little way of telling the difference between the two. So goldfinch is a species that has changed its use of gardens over time. These are data since GBW started back in 1995. Again, a shorter run, just so I can get it as big on the screen as possible. But you can see over that period, we saw an increase in the use of gardens. Goldfinches are particularly mobile. They're what we call a partial migrant. In some winters, a greater proportion of the individuals moves overseas to winter in France and Spain and Portugal and Belgium. In other years, more of them stay here. So it's quite mobile. And it's one of the farmland birds that's really been able to turn to gardens and increase its use of gardens over time. And so we see this increase in the reporting rate. The other interesting thing we see is this seasonal pattern of the peak. You can see we've got a big spike and then just after it, this little pronounced spike. And when we first looked at this, we thought, oh, that's interesting. And we found that the timing of the second little spike matched when these birds should have been egg laying and producing eggs. And we wondered whether it was just females coming back into gardens to feed and pick up resources around the breeding season. But it's clearly changed over time. More recent years, we've actually got a match in the two, and that is quite interesting. And we're now wondering, well, okay, is it to do with the breeding season, or actually is it to do with the partial migration? Is this another wave of birds coming back through? So there's some interesting questions that we can address with these data, because the data set is huge and it's recorded weekly. So it reveals some really interesting stuff. Being able to look at change in that way to pick up the long-term patterns is really, really valuable. And I just wanted to showcase one story that illustrates this, and that's to do with greenfinch. Greenfinch is a species that when you look at the Garden BirdWatch data, pretty much wasn't doing anything for a long while. So from 1995, when we started, through to the mid-2000s, you can see the reporting rate has the seasonal pattern, peak and trough, but it's pretty consistent from year to year. And then from 2006 onwards, we saw this steady decline in the reporting rate. So fewer gardens were reporting greenfinch in any given week. If we look at the data in a different way, because we don't just record presence absence, we also count numbers. This is a similar sort of plot, the year along the bottom, but this time the axis up the side, the y-axis, shows the average maximum weekly count per garden. And again, these darker lines at the bottom are the most recent years, that for that particular study, which is the 2005-2006 period, going back to 95. And you can see that over that period, the average greenfinch flock size in gardens in the summer months drops from about 3.5 down to 2. And in the winter months, it's dropping down from about 4.5 down to 2. So this is not just fewer birds about, but the flock sizes are dropping. At the same time as we were recording those data, we were also doing work with the Zoological Society of London and RSPB, looking at disease. And at the time, we were really looking at Salmonella and E. coli, two things that we knew were important in garden birds and other birds. And then suddenly we saw this thing going on with greenfinch, and we were doing some work, we were doing postmortems, and it revealed the presence of this new disease. And not necessarily the best slide to show around dinner time, but this is a postmortem of a greenfinch. And what we found was these birds are being seen alive around feeding stations. They're fluffed up, they're lethargic, they're wet around the bill, and then they die. And the postmortem revealed that there's infection, secondary infection in the throat, and the birds are unable to swallow food. They get the secondary infection and they die. Work that we then did, working with UEA, University of East Anglia, revealed the cause. And it's this little thing here in the black and white image. This is a protozoal parasite called Trichomonas. And this is the disease agent. And by doing work on the DNA on that agent, we were able to establish the type of trichomonad that it was. It's a thing called trichomonad, kinds of these. And that bit, the gallinate bit, is important. We'll come back to that in a sec. So we had evidence of disease, but the question was, is this disease causing the decline? So what we were then able to do was because we have garden bird watchers recording across the country, because we had this network of people looking out for diseased birds, we could log the incidence, the red dots showing the incidence of confirmed trichomonas, and we could then categorize and split the country into different regions based on how prevalent the disease was. And we found that the highest prevalence in that first year, in 2006, was in the West Midlands. In 2007-8, it spread into East Anglia and the southeast, and then it went up to Scotland, and then we found it in Scandinavia. So it was moving. And we were able to model the impact. We were able to look at the population change in greenfinch, chaffinch, and dunnock. And dunnock was a control for us because it wasn't using feeders. And it showed that in those areas of the high incidence, we had lost a third of our breeding greenfinches within a year, and a fifth of our breeding chaffinches. So this disease was having a tremendous impact. The question of why these two species were the ones really impacted, we still haven't completely explained, but it could be a behavioural thing. It could be something to do with the susceptibility. And what we found was that chaffinch recovered, greenfinch kept going down. And we also saw it in lots of other bird species. Sparrowhawk, for example, which doesn't eat seed, so isn't at the feeding stations, but is predating these birds. And we knew that the disease was being passed from one individual to another through saliva and feces, and that's how it was spreading. And the important thing was, well, where did this come from? How did this suddenly emerge in finches? And I mentioned that the parasite was called Trichomonas gallinae. When we looked at the DNA from the samples that we had, and we compared them with a database of other samples collected from other species and from various other sites, the closest match we got was for samples that had been taken from wood pigeons. So we think that there was the spillover event because Trichomonas is present in wood pigeons across Europe into finches, probably at garden feeding stations, and then that then had this long-term impact on chaffinches, and they still have not recovered, and they probably won't. Worryingly, chaffinch seemed to recover, but since 2012, the population has been in free fall, and we're doing work at the moment, funded through donations, that is looking to answer, is this disease or is it something else? So gardens can be really positive. They provide food resources that birds can use. It can get them into breeding condition, it can get them through the winter months. It can be important for farmland species and rare species like searle bunting. But there are costs, and we have to understand the balance between the two. I want to mention one other disease very quickly, just because it's something that you might have seen. And this is a thing called Paraday pox. You might be familiar with seeing pox-like lesions, quite small little growths on things like house sparrow, blackbird, dunnock in particular, and they tend to be quite small, quite short-lived. And then suddenly a few years ago, we started seeing much bigger lesions in the tits, particularly great tit and blue tit, which we hadn't had before. And again, we were able to use the data from Garden BirdWatch, from the parallel work that we were doing with the vets, to build up a picture. And this showed that this disease, this virus, emerged, was first reported in the UK on the south coast, and it moved north. And it can be spread by contact from bird to bird or from bird to surface to bird, but also by biting insects. We looked again at the genetics, what was involved, and we found that actually it was very similar to what was being seen in Europe, elsewhere in Europe. We suspect that at some point with warm weather, some biting insects, black flies or something, came across the channel and introduced it into the population, and it has since spread. And we've been able to work with researchers at Oxford University who've got a study population there to look at its impact on the population. So really, really important to be able to do all this. The final example I want to give about how feeding can change populations and behaviour is blackcap. So this is a species that we think of as a summer visitor. Data from bird ringing shows that our breeders leave the UK in the autumn. The green arrows on the map here, they winter, these birds winter, the dark blue dots, down around the Mediterranean, North Africa, down into Northwest Africa. They return in the spring, the pale lemon yellow. But we also get passage birds from further north, the orange arrows. And interestingly, we see an arrival of birds in autumn from Central Europe. And these are birds that have always been coming here. We've always had small numbers. If you look back in the historic records, there are records of blackcaps here outside the breeding season in the depths of winter. But we are seeing more and more of this. And when you look at the Garden BirdWatch reporting rate, you see this very pronounced winter spike in garden use. And if you split that up in the way that we did for robin right at the start of the talk, by the type of garden, you get this really, really interesting pattern. That winter peak is predominantly in urban and suburban gardens. And then in the breeding season, it is rural gardens that are most heavily used. And work in Europe has shown that these are continental breeding birds that migrate to the UK. They winter in the wider countryside initially, and then they move into gardens. And the fact that this pattern of behaviour has increased is because of evolution, and it's been driven by two things. And we've been able to analyse the Garden BirdWatch data. And this is probably the most complex graph I'll show you tonight. So I just want to explain it. Along the bottom is a measure of how often food is provided at a site, at a garden. And again, it's a proportion, it runs from 0 to 1. Up the left-hand side is a similar measure. It's an occupancy rate, like the reporting rate. And in this case, it runs from 0 to 8, but it effectively goes to 1, but it's not showing on here. So the further to the right, the more food is available at the site. The higher up, the greater that garden is used by blackcaps. And there are two things to take home. If we just look at the red area at the top and the dashed line in the middle of it, as you increase the proportion of weeks fed, the occupancy rate goes up. So blackcaps make greater use of gardens where more food is provided. And if you also look at the difference between the red, the yellow and the green, those are gardens classified by how urbanized they are. So blackcaps use urban gardens more than they do less urbanized gardens. So that tells us two things. We also brought in temperature as well to our models. We now know that blackcap use of gardens, which is increasing in the UK, has been driven by increased food availability and climate change. And the reason these birds are using urban sites more than less urbanized sites isn't because there's more food there. It's actually because those sites are warmer in winter. And the reason they're warmer in winter is because of all the waste heat that escapes from our houses and offices. It makes wintering conditions better for these birds. And it's one of the reasons you see pied wagtails, for example, coming into urban areas to roost of an evening. So we are driving evolutionary change in blackcaps because we are feeding birds. The other thing, just quickly to say, is the garden environment is different. There is more food, there's different food, there's less invertebrate food, there's more seeds because of the food we put out. But the suite of predators there is different. So whereas a bird nesting in the wider countryside might have to worry about things like weasels and rats, in an urban setting, it might be cats, it might be squirrels, it might be magpies. There is this different guild of predators. And so there are different hazards. There's different predator hazards. There are different physical hazards like glass windows, like light, like pesticides, like netting, a whole range of things that can have an impact. So how has the garden bird community changed over time? You know, how have birds responded to the built environment and the food that we provide? We've been able to look at that again using data from BTO surveys. We have shown, because we have feeding data from the Garden Bird Feeding Survey that goes all the way back to the 1970s, that the community in gardens has become more diverse. And that is really, really interesting. We now support more birds at garden feeding stations than we used to. So whereas, you know, traditionally it might have been a few species, including things like house sparrow. It's now much more diverse. And of course, the foods have changed, as well as seed and peanut. We're putting out fewer kitchen scraps, but we're putting out more suet products. And that might have an impact on the birds as well. The composition of those, we need to understand what is the impact. Just as, if people are living off fast food, that has impacts on them compared to people that are living on a much healthier diet. And again, it's something that we've looked at. This is a little bit of work. All you need to really understand is that fat can have an impact on the quality of birds. And if you put in vitamin E, it can kind of counter that. So we need to understand the makeup of these foods, really, to understand their impacts on birds. So think of the urban environment as a series of opportunities and constraints. There's trees, there's bird feeders, there's positive things, there are negative things like windows and cars, and understanding that is really, really key, and that is something that we need to factor in to urban planning. So what about the broader impacts? Can we identify anything that says, oh, actually, yeah, gardens and the built environment are good or they're detrimental? Well, there's a couple of interesting studies that I want to just mention before we wrap up. The first is one that looks at the impacts at a genetic level on birds. So at the end of our chromosomes and at the end of bird chromosomes are these little areas called telomeres. And they're really little bits of code that protect the core code in the middle of the chromosome. And studies have shown that the longer the telomere, the longer that protective tip, the better quality an individual is, the healthier an individual is. And if an individual is stressed and living a poor life, then those get impacted. And studies have shown that blackbirds living in the built environment have shorter telomeres than those living in rural environments, suggesting that there is a cost to these birds. There can be behavioural costs. So robins in the built environment and blackbirds and other species that are advertising territory will change the timing of their song. They might be more likely to sing at night than during the day because of traffic noise. So we need to understand the consequences of things like that. And we also need to understand, as I touched on earlier with disease, the impacts of changes elsewhere and what they might mean. Woodpigeons have benefited from agricultural change. Green food available through the winter months means that population has gone through the roof. They've expanded into gardens, but they brought disease with them, and that's put them into close contact with finches, and we've had the spillover. So we really need to do work to understand the consequences of doing things for wildlife in gardens. Now, hopefully at this stage, as we come to the end, you're just thinking, well, okay, that question you posed at the start, are gardens good for birds? I'm not so sure now. Are they good or are they not good? And I think, the jury is still out. I think probably we're saying, yeah, gardens are good. I mean, they're good for several reasons. They do give these opportunities for many species. They do counter some of the damage we do elsewhere, but it's not straightforward and we need to understand it better. Just putting out food isn't enough. We need to understand the type of food we're putting out and what impact it might be. It's really important that we do that. And if you then scale that up to think about the future and what I said at the start about us becoming more urbanized, if we're doing big things like planning green cities, here's a plan for a city in China, this idea of nature being in the heart of the city. Well, what is the consequences of that? What nature are we going to see? Think about house sparrow. House sparrow used to be really, really common in the built environment, benefited from the fact that transport was horses and there were loads of invertebrates in cities, and that did them really well. Now that we don't have invertebrate populations in cities to the same extent, their population has declined. If we want them back, we've got to get the habitat right. We've got to get the feeding opportunities right. Species like Spotty Flycatcher, again, this is a species that has really declined. We've lost it from a lot of woodlands, but it still occurs in some big suburban gardens. And the question is, well, what is it about them that gives this species what it wants? So understanding gardens is really, really important. And that question about, are gardens good for birds? You also need to view more widely, because watching garden birds, seeing behaviours like aggressive interactions, having those encounters, actually is really beneficial for people. And if people can get excited about garden birds, then hopefully they will do things that benefit wildlife more broadly. And that in turn means that gardens should, in the future, be good for birds, and they should be good for butterflies and other things, because people are taking the interest and taking the time to look. So it's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of gardens and that question of, are they good, are they bad? And I hope you will take away from it that, yeah, on the whole, we think they're good, but it's not a straightforward thing and we need to do work. And one of the ways in which we're able to do that work is because of surveys like Garden BirdWatch. As I say, it's free to participate. Anybody can do it. And it's about recording what we see in gardens and then using that information alongside that to tease out the answers to these questions and to test them through the analysis that we do. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was a really fascinating talk, and thank you at the end for highlighting the importance of the data and the really detailed analysis that is helping us to understand the birds and use of gardens in such great detail. I was fascinated by the seasonal kind of patterns and how different species seem to be kind of impacted in different ways, and certainly the kind of idea about thinking of gardens as offering both opportunities and constraints. I think that's something obviously we need to, the more we study and the more we understand, the more we will kind of tease out the pluses and the minuses. We've got many questions. The chat's been very busy. We've got many questions coming through. So, and also if people would like to ask questions in person, we might have time for one or two. So please do raise your virtual hand. But I'm going to go over now to David. And if you could pick up just a few of the really interesting questions that are coming through in the chat, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll do that. So we probably won't get to all of them, but there's a few here. There were a few questions about, given the importance of the things you talk about, of knowing what to feed. How do people know what would be good food to feed? There's suggestions of, the RSPB food, suet pellets and things. How do we know what's good to feed our garden birds?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's always a challenge, because you go into a garden centre, or even these days a supermarket, and you're presented with all this food. There's a massive range of food, and a lot of it is packaged in a way to kind of get you to buy it. And I think a lot of the bird food companies are coming to this quite late. They've discovered they can sell food, but they don't really understand the impacts or the consequences of that. And it's only more recently that organisations like BTO and RSPB have actually started to get involved and really start to think, okay, well, what is the impact of these different things? And to fund things like the PhDs and stuff, looking at the impacts of, say, vitamin E in these and fats. So the thing I would say is you tend to get what you pay for. So if it's really cheap, you might have a lot of filler in there, and that might be large bits of grain. It might even be bits that look a bit like hamster food and biscuits. They're fillers, they're cheap. Put them in, they bulk it out. So you tend to go for more expensive foods. You tend to get better quality. I would always buy straight foods rather than mixes, because what you tend to find is if you put a seed mix in a feeder, a bird will come along that likes a certain type of seed, and it'll just sit there and it'll just fling out all the stuff that it can't handle quickly. And then something else will come along and throw out another load of stuff. So if you only give them the choice of one, but have it in different feeders, that can make a difference. Sunflower hearts definitely seem to be good. They're high energy, high oil content. There are some questions around the impacts of just feeding on that, but birds feed on other stuff. Peanuts you need to be careful with, because they can have aflatoxin, and we've been looking at that in garden birds, and it's about how you keep them. And these days, just feed small amounts. Feed them in a mesh feeder.
Thanks, Mike. And there was a couple of other comments and questions about what would be good advice to ensure hygiene in bird feeders and avoid some of these diseases that you've talked about.
Yeah, it's all about breaking the transmission between individuals, because we can't treat these birds with compounds, veterinary compounds or anything like that in the wild. So you've got to break the transmission. So the first thing to say is clean your feeders. Clean your feeders weekly or fortnightly. What I do is I have two sets of feeders. I have one lot that are out and are being used. Every week they come down, they get washed, the other lot go up, and you give them time to dry. Just a mild disinfectant. You can get vet safe products like Arc Cleanse that will do it, or bleach, diluted bleach solution will do the same thing. wear gloves, wash your hands, arms really thoroughly afterwards, because things like salmonella you can catch. I once had a lady delight in telling me that she cleaned her bird feeders regularly, and she put them in her dishwasher after she'd done her dishes, or it might have been when she did her dishes. And those are exactly the kind of things you should not be doing. Do it outside, do it regularly, and that will break the chain.
Excellent. That's good advice to everybody. I hope is going, if they're not doing that already, are going to start doing that. I'm going to ask a slightly stats nerdy question. And oddly, it's not a stats nerdy question for me. This one's from Angela Evans Hill. Angela was asking about the chart you showed with the different usage rates in urban and suburban rural areas. Is that reporting rate going to be affected by the possibility that people in urban areas don't record as much as people in rural areas?
It should be consistent within a species. So we can look at recording effort, how many weeks people record. There are biases. So, our gardens are not, the people that participate in GBW are not representative of all gardens. They tend to be people that have more time, have more money, tend to have a more educated background. So they don't reflect the average garden, but they are, they are a good sample. And the kind of things that might differ between urban, suburban and rural actually is the nature of the garden. So we collect some basic habitat data, but it might be that rural gardens have more cover in and around them than urban gardens. And so some species might be easier to see in some types of garden than others. And, garden size in particular can influence that. And we know that garden size tends to be larger if you're rural than suburban, and equally suburban is larger than urban.
Excellent, thank you.
David, we've probably got time for maybe just one last question, if you want to pick one last thing out, because
one
we're
last
pretty much
question.
on time.
Well, let's ask a question that mentions earthworms, because we've got Kieran, who runs the earthworm scheme, on the call as well. So we might as well combine two into things. So Alice Burnett asked about do blackbirds in particular, but do they prefer certain soil types for getting out worms? And she notes her soil has heavy clay that bakes very hard in hot weather.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we a separate study to GBW that we've been running is a thing called What's Under Your Feet, where we've had school children digging up playing fields and looking at the invertebrates that they find. And there is variation. I don't think they look specifically at geology, but clearly geology and soil type will influence earthworm distribution and availability. If you've got a soil that dries out quickly and the earthworms go deeper during a dry spell, then I suspect that will make them unavailable more quickly. And if you've got a garden where your soil is moist throughout, then there's probably better feeding opportunities for these birds. And if you think about the wider countryside, a lot of the species declines that we've seen have been linked to landscape change, and drainage of landscapes has been a really important thing, not just for the obvious species, but for other birds that feed their young on soil invertebrates like starlings and blackbirds.
Thank you very much. That was, again, a really kind of interesting, again, this is some of these questions are really quite complex and involved. But yeah, I'm sure Kieran's glad we got a little earthworm mentioned in there. I see someone's put in the chat the link to the garden survey. So please do join in with that. But we've got time. We haven't got any time for any more questions. Sorry if we didn't get to yours, but there were lots. There's lots of also very positive comments, Mike, about your talk. Lots of people saying thank you. Found that really fascinating talk.